champagne jacket with the pocket kerchief is a nice touch, very classy.
Well, I'm giving a talk.
Yeah, I appreciate the consideration.
You could address a little bit.
I'm definitely underdressed for this.
I'm inspired by Jeffrey Tucker.
Yeah.
I can't hold a candle to him.
You wouldn't get caught dead in shorts on
Well, Jeffrey Tucker, he lives in Massachusetts or whatever. He has this sort of New England Ivy look. The shorts with the blazer that's classic Massachusetts.
Get the Bermuda shorts.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. I think we'll start, and maybe some more people will come in. Yeah. All right. Well, welcome to our panel discussion on Pan-Secessionism. I'm sure you guys probably know what secession is, right? Either it's the Civil War or Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia breaking up. Pan-Secessionism is a libertarian idea. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Keith Preston. He's an anarchist. He came up with this idea as a strategy in the late 90s, early 2000s, where basically a coalition of secessionist forces in America and all over the world could work together to dismantle the state. Not necessarily just libertarians or libertarian movements, but people who are fighting against big states, especially imperial states like America, like Russia, like China. All the dissident groups in that empire would help to break it up. A good example of how this works in practice, I think, is the Burma Civil War. So you have a central government, maybe you guys are familiar, but it had a sort of democracy in 2016, but then it went back to a military dictatorship in 2020. So the liberal pro-democracy groups in the populous parts of Burma have allied with these ethnic minority separatist groups up in like the northern mountains, and they're fighting the centralizing state. And it's not just one minority and they want independence. It's 12 different ethnic groups, and they all want independence for their own specific ethnic groups. And something like that could be a productive push against American imperialism. So you've got, obviously, the Free State Project. There's secession. There's some people who want secession for New Hampshire in the Free State Project. Not everyone. The New Hampshire Libertarian Party is pretty pro-secession. But if we were just to secede, the likelihood that the United States government would just let us go is pretty low. It's a pretty small state, and people in America still see secession as a civil war thing, right? That it's really about people being able to oppress other people, right? If we allied with different groups in the United States who also want to break up the United States, you have people who want Texas to become independent. You have people who want California to be independent. Those are kind of the mainstream ones. You've got people in Hawaii, in Puerto Rico, in Alaska who want independence. And you also have different groups, like the people talking about national divorce, like a liberal America breaking up, or a conservative red tribe America. You have the Dakota Indians, who they've actually declared the Republic of Lakota, mostly symbolic, but there's a lot of Native Americans from all over the country that want either much greater autonomy or full independence. So they could be part of a coalition. A black separatist movement could be part of a coalition. And if all of these groups are together, especially if you have like ethnic minorities, the narrative that secession is just about oppression and racism starts to break down. People don't have the kind of mental blocks against it they would have if it was just New Hampshire. Let me think. What else am I forgetting here? Oh yeah. Is anyone familiar here with Liberland, the microstate? Right. So it's a libertarian microstate in former Yugoslavia. It has been recognized diplomatically by a unrecognized state in Africa, Somaliland, which is northern Somalia. And Somaliland, I know the joke is, libertarians should move to Somalia, right? Most of Somalia, not a great place. I mean, not terrible, not as horrible as the states we have, we believe, but there's generally like a lack of law and order, a lack of like economic stability. That's not the case in Somaliland itself. It's a secessionist. It's basically the only functioning part of Somalia, because these people, originally they were part of the British Empire, while the rest of Somalia was part of the Italian Empire. After World War II, they became one state. And the northern Somalians have always wanted independence since then. They finally got it after the communist government of Somalia collapsed in the 90s, and they've been able to actually have like a stable society. But Somaliland itself aside, they've chosen to diplomatically recognize Liberland. And this, I think, could be a kind of template of what we should be looking at on an international scale. So, libertarians, who generally speaking support decentralization, we should be pushing for acceptance and understanding of the different secessionist movements that happen all over the world. For example, in Western Sahara, it's an unrecognized state. Morocco is trying to assimilate it into itself. Maybe you guys heard in the news, Donald Trump basically got Morocco to recognize Israel in exchange for basically America saying, oh, Morocco owns Western Sahara. But the facts on the ground is the Polisario Front, it's a Western Saharan nationalist movement. They're fighting, and they continue to fight Morocco because they don't want Morocco to own them. They want to be independent. If libertarians want people to be less against the concept of secession, we should start talking about places like this, or in like Burma, where there's not that baggage of the American Civil War, there's no baggage of slavery. It's a country is trying to conquer another country.
Kurds.
The Kurds, another great example, especially because they're libertarian, or libertarian socialists. They actually don't have taxes, which is nice. Or the Zapatistas in southern Mexico. They don't like to be called communists, but they don't allow private property. But they have like a communitarian, libertarian, stateless society in southern Mexico. And the Mexican government has just basically agreed to a truce since the 90s. So there's just a part of Mexico where like communists like
No Janet Reno in Mexico.
That's right, yes. They're very well armed too.
Yeah.
So if we start talking about these kinds of movements and then say we libertarians want our own state away from, or whatever. We would, not a state, but we want our own polity where we can be libertarians. That starts to sound less crazy once you've already gotten someone to say, well, yeah, Morocco shouldn't just have this place because it was granted by the United States, or Tigray in Ethiopia. The Tigrayans have the right; they actually have the right to secede in the constitution, but the Ethiopian government just ignored that. So all these different cases of like ethnic minorities wanting to break off of a larger state. If we can normalize that as libertarians, our secessionist desires might be a lot better. It might be easier to reach. So, John, would you like to add anything?
Sure. That was Adrian Shepard, everyone. He hold your applause, he runs the Springtime of Nations YouTube channel, which documents all these pan-secessionist movements across the world. I'm John Gregory. I voice a lot of the videos. It's great because when people hear him, they think I write them, but he writes them. I'm a stand-up comedian in Miami. This is my second year at Porcfest, and I think pan-secessionism is a really important thing that libertarians should discuss right now, because with everything we're seeing with basically, we all know the World Economic Forum is trying to create like a one world government, basically, and we're seeing NGOs in Europe and across the world kind of overruling state sovereignty. Like, I think the European Human Rights Court just got the United Kingdom to not deport a refugee who had committed a crime. And so, like, these things I find very concerning, because, like, when people in Belgium or in Washington, D.C. can tell people in the United Kingdom or Alaska what they can and can't do, I agree with the, I think it is one of the best long-term strategies for international liberty. And there's so many. The channel is great because you learn about so many different periods in history and different people. I love the video on Burma, Catalonia. There's just so many different interesting pan-secessionist movements. So I'd like to gauge the crowd here a little bit. What's your name?
Light.
What's that?
Light.
Light?
Yeah.
Like Light Yagami?
Like it comes from the
Okay,
sky.
cool. So,
Hyogami, yeah.
yeah. So how do you feel about secession in general? Like, do you feel like it's a subject that you can approach people on, like in the liberty movement, or do you feel like it still has kind of that stigma? Or you don't even care about it?
I'm not sure about stigma. I mean, it's certainly controversial. We just had a secession debate in the State House here in New Hampshire, and only 11 representatives voted yes for it, even though we have a lot more liberty-friendly legislators. So it's controversial, but I personally support it.
Yeah.
And I think you could even make a constitutional argument for it, but even irregardless, I'm generally supportive of it.
Yeah, I think the Constitution does support secession. I mean, that was one of the main arguments that the Confederacy made when they were trying to leave the United States, was that the colonies did the exact same thing to the crown. So.
And most importantly, the Constitution doesn't explicitly forbid it or really even speak to it at all. And so, given the 10th Amendment, you would think that right would, be retained by the states to leave if they wanted to. But, anyways.
Yeah. No, that's true. Does anyone here have like a problem with secession?
Your comments made me think about Taiwan for some reason. I heard some interesting. They asked why don't you declare independence? She said, well, we are independent.
Yeah,
Right.
they're already independent.
Yeah.
They've
So I
already
don't need
declared
to
it.
declare.
Yeah.
If I could answer that,
Yeah.
I think part of the reason is I'm not sure that it calls itself the Republic of China. I'm not. I think it might still recognize all of China as under its control, even though it obviously is not.
Well, it's a
That's
subtle
part of
thing.
why.
You don't want to be like, fuck you to the guys with the guns. But if you get to the point where you have the rights that you're looking for under a secession, so if you're like, we need this and this is why we're seceding, right? If you could actually get that stuff, at that point, are you going to be like, hey, let's yell for secession? No, you're going to be like, it's all good, guys.
Right. Although
But you're
you have-
right. Taiwan says it's the real China, and all of China is the Republic of China.
Well, then,
and that's different than.
Well, two things. There's political debate within Taiwan. You have the KMT, which was the traditional ruling party of Taiwan. They're still quote unquote pan-Chinaists. So they're the ones claiming, and it's kind of funny. You can look at the map of like what they actually are claiming. It includes parts of Russia too, because remember these guys they got kicked out in 1949 out of the rest of China, and China was still like claiming all of Mongolia too. That's what Taiwan claims, which kind of sounds crazy. The new party, the Liberals, the DPP, they are way more Taiwanists, so they're not actually interested in furthering those plans. Now, it's politically politically complicated because there's a lot of people in Taiwan that still believe that. Even if they vote for DPP, they still think Taiwan is China and is the rightful rulers. I actually think that was a good point, though. You brought up the idea that if you get independence in all but name, why go for independence, especially if there's high costs?
This sort of raises an interesting question, sort of conceptual question about libertarianism in general, which is that, we talk about has Taiwan really seceded officially? And you realize that official title is sort of just a question of sort of who's writing the rules. That, right, there's some degree to which what is a recognized state versus an unrecognized state just has to do with, the United States hegemony just completely infiltrating the air we breathe. Right? At the end of the day, it's just a bunch of guys smoking cigars saying, that's that and that's that. They just said so. Right? And that, at some level, this stuff about secession, if you become ungovernable, right? Has Porcfest seceded from New Hampshire? Well, I can go buy illegal drugs around the corner here and nobody's stopping me. And so, in some piecemeal way, that's quasi-secession, right? And
de facto secession.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's another thing to consider here too, which is that secession the forces of secession in general start to weaken the foundation of broad rule,
a perceived legitimate authority.
Exactly.
The Zapatistas in Mexico is a great example. Mexico doesn't say Chiapas, which is the southernmost state that borders Guatemala. They don't say that that's the Zapatistas' state or whatever. They say that's part of Mexico. The Zapatistas are happy to let them say it's part of Mexico. Meanwhile, they're actually running the show.
And the Amish have essentially seceded from a modern American society as well. Well, White Knight, you want to give your spiel?
More power to them.
I don't really have a spiel.
He's just the eye candy.
Yeah, I just glad I have the right to secede from my darn ex-wife.
Well, I actually think that's a lot of that rhetoric about national divorce or whatever. I think that's maybe not that helpful because divorce is
sad.
It's a acrimonious thing, right? But how many of you guys have had roommates, maybe in college or now, and you were like good friends, and you're like, hey, let's we'll split the lease, right? And then you're living with them, and it's kind of like intolerable to live with
You
this
spend
guy
the whole week
that
at
you love.
Porcfest in an RV with them. Yeah.
Right, yeah. You love the guy, but you can't stand the way he chooses food or that he doesn't do the dishes or whatever. And I think that kind of thing where it's like, we're friends, but we don't have to be together.
Yeah.
You don't have to live with your best friend.
Because this is something too where there's like a cultural thing where I think like right wingers sometimes, especially sort of more rural ones, and then like libertarians, especially in New Hampshire, as we get out into I'm not in the city where they have all these laws and and to some degree it's a nice place to visit, but maybe not a nice place to live. And when you go somewhere, when you're a libertarian and you're able to live your life as you want it, maybe when you're on your vacation in Italy, well, they make us do this here, but then I can go home and be free. And that's good. You can enjoy the way that they live there. You can enjoy the lifestyle of other places that people have the free entrance and exit into without having it imposed on you on every square inch of this world.
He's not talking about sex tourism.
No, I'm not. No, despite appearances.
So one thing that I'm interested in is at the state level here in New Hampshire, making it allowable for people to basically create like special economic zones, kind of, but at the state level, where like we don't have to worry about what the feds say. we can basically do it at the state level, and then it would be almost like treated the same way that at the state level in places where cannabis is legal, they say the state isn't going to stop you. But if the feds want to come in and enforce their laws, well, you're going to have to deal with that. But like, I think it would be interesting if at the state level they basically said you can, declare yourself like a free zone or whatever, and do whatever you want. Maybe there's a buffer, like you have to own a certain amount of land, and there has to be a certain buffer of just like no development between you and the next town over.
I have to imagine New Hampshire would want you to pay for the privilege, though.
You might. I mean, there might be an annual fee or something like that to do this, but like, you could. I think it would be really interesting if they just allowed you to set up these kind of like islands of experimentation of, like no regulations for building or no drug laws or whatever. And like I said, putting a buffer between you and neighboring counties, and maybe allowing law enforcement to come in if they think there's a fugitive hiding or something on your land or something like that. But other than that, they leave you alone.
Well, this is actually a very American idea, right? That they referred to the states as laboratory of democracy.
Right. How small down can we actually get that
well,
idea?
I think a lot of us in this room wanted to go down to one person.
I was very sympathetic to the Republic in Key West trying to secede from the state of Florida. And even though they always knew it was never really going to happen and it was kind of a meme, like if you go down to Key West, it is a totally different vibe from the rest of the state of Florida, which is a different vibe from the rest of the country.
I think what you were talking, really what we're talking about here is nullification, right? And nullification, where the state is going to protect you from the feds trying to regulate your buildings, your food, etc. I think a free zone would be a form of nullification, and ultimately nullification is in a way secession. It's the states asserting their right over the feds.
Well, here in this case, what I'm proposing is it's a kind of like nullification, but not exactly, because like I said, in California, for example, where they first passed medical cannabis laws, like the state would not bother you if you were growing cannabis or whatever, but the feds could come in and enforce that, and they did many times. And the state, they throw their hands up and they're like, we're not going to help them, but we're not going to get in their way either. I think it would be a similar deal here, where like we're not setting the state up to go to war against the feds if they try to come in and enforce whatever prohibition on your free territory, but like the state's not going to help them either.
Well,
or mess with you.
Well, wouldn't we want the state to go to bat for us if we can get it?
I mean, if you can get it, but do you also want to spark a civil war?
Adrian does.
I would be interested in but like what you're saying, that would basically be effectively secessionist. And so at that point, I think you might as well secede.
Well, okay. So let's go back. I think you're right about the way that cannabis legalization happened for a long time in the states, like since the early 2000s. But now, states are taking a much more active role in combating, the DEA being able to just come in and basically loot all of the businesses in, like, for example, Colorado. Right? They're much more willing to sue the state. And that doesn't mean the feds are going to invade. There's a certain level of tit for tat. You're suing them in court or whatever. It's not like the National Guard and the feds are like clashing over. But there is an active pushback against the feds being able to come in nowadays. That's a big part of secession. For example, gun rights, and people. I think there's even there's a speaking event here where they're talking about nullification for gun rights, where the ATF will not be allowed to come in and like take NFA, firearms from them. Does that mean it's a civil war? I don't know. There's that guy who unfortunately left us talking about if you have independence in all but name. This could be a thing where basically New Hampshire is on paper a state, but the federal government has no power there. And maybe the government's just like, it's not worth invading New Hampshire and trying to, having to kill New Hampshire National Guardsmen to assert what they're not contesting. They're not contesting that they're a state of the United States. But illegally speaking, de facto, they are independent. So I think there's a little leeway there if we're talking about, what we can actually get away with without, gunfire. What do you think?
I was kind of actually having a conversation, the similar conversation with these guys, because we were just in this talk where he was talking about basically using the state to try to avoid federal income taxes. And I was saying this isn't really going to work because the state is just going to start picking off individuals and making examples and freaking everybody else out who has something to lose into thinking, I don't want to be next. I'm just going to start paying my taxes in. And so, similarly, I think, you would have a situation where the state starts, picking off people who set up their little islands of sovereignty under the state law, and, basically scaring anybody else from trying to do the same. Unless the state intervenes and actually says, no, we're going to protect them. But that's not what I'm even asking for. I think that the state would basically just stand aside and say, you take your risks, go do what you want. We won't interfere, but if the feds want to come in and enforce their laws, you're on your own. And I see that being the legal way of doing it, in the same way that Prop 215 and the other cannabis laws were all the legal way of doing it. It's constitutional. It's constitutional. They're not. The feds aren't saying to the state, you can't decriminalize cannabis. They're just saying, if you do that, we still reserve the right to come in and enforce federal cannabis laws. But
don't you think it's a win that the state wouldn't be assisting the feds, because a lot of their firepower and their surge power to enforce this stuff does come from help from the state? Wouldn't that be a good thing?
It is a win. Yeah. I think those laws were great, and they were important steps on the way to what we actually want, which is federal decriminalization, to just be free. But I'm saying that once you get to the point where you're actually asking the state to enforce your ability to break federal law, that's effectively secessionism, because you're setting up a constitutional argument of the state's rights versus federal rights. And I think if you can actually convince the state to do that for one issue, you might as well just say, we're seceding. And
well, I disagree with that, because I think that if there was say there was a standoff with New Hampshire sheriffs versus the ATF, the New Hampshire sheriffs just formed a human wall, basically preventing the ATF from violating someone's rights. I think that it would still favor the state of New Hampshire to be we did nullification on this one issue, but we are not officially declaring secession from the federal government, because then that's when the federal government is going to have to make an example out of New Hampshire, And I do think sheriffs can play a role in not only not enforcing federal laws, but obstructing the enforcement of federal laws by federal agents without having officially declared secession.
And in a given state, you might have one particular issue that really galvanizes people, but also that it's in the interest of the state itself. I'm thinking, for instance, let's say either in Alaska or Texas, let's say, the feds keep clamping down on oil production, right? So then eventually Texas is well, but we have all the soil and you're not letting us drill for it. We're going to nullify on that particular thing. They would have, the state and the people would have a strong incentive to do that, even if they didn't want to secede on everything. You know what I mean?
He's like, no. Well, check out the Springtime of Nations YouTube channel.
Yes, a lot of our stuff is specifically learning how different secession movements have developed. And a lot of the reason is, I mean, not necessarily ideological. A lot of it's like you were talking about, disgruntlement about oil. I mean, in Nigeria, the southeastern part of it is very oil rich and very Christian. But the rest of the country is broadly Muslim
And poor.
and a lot poorer. Yeah, they're like cow herders. Yeah, got no oil. And back in the day, even before oil, they had palm oil was the main export. So this region called Biafra, they wanted to secede. But of course, the Nigerian government didn't want to give up on that oil revenue. So Biafra, the Nigerian Civil War, is one of the bloodiest conflicts in African history. 2 million people died, a lot of civilians starved to death because Biafra was totally cut off. And the British and American governments were helping the Nigerians, as well as the Soviets too.
Like, when was this?
1967 to 1970. It's actually, this is why the Doctors Without Borders was founded, because normally how aid worked was, the government of the United States would spend development aid, money, and that would be given to humanitarian aid. But in this case, the Western world totally turned its back on Biafra, and they were starving to death. So all these, this is like the start of the NGO era, because people still wanted to help, but you couldn't get dollars from the governments of the Western powers. So they did it themselves. But yeah, Biafra, great example, because there's economic reasons to want to secede.
There were ethnic underpinnings to the Nigerian Civil War.
Wouldn't it,
True. Yeah.
wouldn't it be inaccurate to call it a civil war then? Because it seems like it was just a secession movement.
Well, it depends who you're asking.
Yeah.
That's right, of course.
You can say the same thing about the American Civil
Yes,
War.
I would say the same thing.
Okay, yeah.
It's the war of northern aggression in Nigeria too. It's the northern government. All kind of, the Quebecois want to secede from Canada for linguistic.
Who wouldn't?
Especially now.
Yeah.
Jeez.
God.
But that's, Canada is a good example of where Pan-Secessionism could be good, because the Quebecois have, for a long time.
Well, and
wanted
then there's
to
also the
secede.
First Nations up north.
First Nations, and not even just up north. The Mohawks, actually, there was a short.
Same region up there.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. They're fight with the Canadian state, and now you have Alberta and Manitoba and Saskatchewan. All these people are like, we have no say over the federal government now. We should secede or join the United States or something like that. So a pan-secessionist coalition in Canada, it could be the First Nations, it could be the Conservatives in the West, and it could be the Quebecois, all fighting against the federal state.
I think Quebecois even has referendums every once in a while.
They
They wanted this for a long time.
It's like the perfect.
And what happens when they have a referendum?
We get a lot of
They lose?
I think that sometimes they
it
don't.
very narrowly lost in the late 90s, 97 or 8. Although the Canadian government said after it, we would not have.
Yeah.
But there was strong support. It was like 49-51, whether or not they wanted to secede. And a lot of the people who were voting no were like recent immigrants who didn't necessarily care about Quebec culture. And why would they? I mean, we wouldn't expect them to. But there, a lot, 49% of people wanted to leave Canada. It's a big deal.
Well, in Catalonia, they held a referendum and it passed, and the Spanish government just dropped the hammer.
I remember when
on it.
that happened. Madrid was sending cruise ships full of policemen
Yeah.
to Barcelona to stop people from voting.
Yes, they physically broke up the voting.
Yeah.
In fact, I even heard that one of the reasons that Spain doesn't recognize Kosovo, which most Western countries do, is because they know if that happens, well, that opens the door for Catalonia.
Yeah.
Same for Scottish independence. Totally against one, the independence itself, and two, especially Scotland being able to join the EU, because that means if Catalonia leaves, then they can join the EU. That's that big scare is, if you secede, you're not going to be let in, and you're going to be impoverished. Spain's not nice. even though they have their own claims on Gibraltar.
Yeah.
Even though the people in Gibraltar are not Spanish, but it's it's a prestige thing. They don't like the idea that Britain owns this tiny little rock right next to it. But hypocrisy among statists is nothing new. Kuda, do you have anything to add?
I know the question that always gets brought up with secessionism is, what if the seceding state ends up having less freedom? Because they
That's a
turn into
very
more
important question.
authoritarian government.
Yeah.
And there's a scale question too, right?
Yes, scale is a very important point when you're talking about the mass oppression of people.
I think there's contemporary examples of this in some of these more right-wing states in Eastern Europe that are affiliated with the EU. And there's a question of, is there critical support for a relatively more libertarian policy being enforced from the top down against some sort of religious revanchism going on in Hungary or something?
Right, or like base protectionism.
Yeah, exactly.
Poland.
Exactly.
There's a lot of people who like Poland for different reasons. I think.
Based Poland.
Yeah, exactly. But the fact is, Poland is a big recipient of EU trade aid. They export their agricultural products, and they're protected by the EU. But the EU, to a certain extent, has imposed liberalism on the economics of Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic and Slovakia now that they seceded, that's a great example of a peaceful secession. They literally decided they didn't want to be roommates anymore.
But that was both sides, so that's a little bit less.
Right, it's a
contentious,
bilateral.
Right? If both
Well,
sides
and the
don't-
argument is that if something like this were to happen in the U.S., it would probably be mutual.
A lot of liberals would like to separate from.
I don't know, but they don't. I don't think they like. A lot of them don't like the idea of letting that go. I don't think they do.
I think you're right. I think they just tweet about it, like moving to Canada or something.
And what Benjamin brought up, like the idea that like we're not gonna let, like for example, like this is something a liberal might say is, listen, fine, you can talk all you want about not having to deal with rednecks, but if we're talking about Mississippi seceding, what about all the black people that are going to be oppressed?
What about the
by
transgender teenagers in Mississippi? And the thing is, I have sympathy for that.
Yeah, me too.
And a free exit system is something that can help with that. But there is, this is why secession is more nuanced than just all secession all the time. If Texas wanted to secede and then said, and now we're going to lynch 90% of our population, Cambodia style, I think I certainly would
George Bush
learn to be less of a shitty gun user than I am now, and I'd probably go try to interfere with that. There's an argument made about the Civil War whenever people talk about slavery, because that's the biggest bugaboo with American secession history, that the South had the right to secede, and people had the right to act in third-party self-defense of slaves. Right? That people could have marched in, that said, you're seceded, and now we're going to march into the South and liberate the slaves and then leave.
Except, interestingly, that they didn't do that when they were part of the Union.
No, they didn't.
Like, that doesn't
No, they
seem,
didn't.
That seems to be a post hoc.
No, they were more into raping and pillaging.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's funny. If you guys have not seen it, or listened to it, the Chris Calton's Historical Controversies from the Mises Institute talks a lot about what people were thinking at the time, right when the Civil War started. And when it started, a lot of people, first of all, were overjoyed that the South seceded, because now the slave power is gone. It's not going to bother us anymore.
We can add states, and we're not going to have that argument.
In the Senate, you can do whatever you want.
That's
they're
right.
not
Yeah,
there
we can
anymore.
finally pass Medicare for all.
Right,
In
but
1865.
Yeah.
and slavery was like, that was not the reason most people wanted to go to war. But later on, talking 1862, 63, you have all these giant battles, bloody battles. The South is like killing like American soldiers. The idea of emancipation becomes a way to punish the South. for doing this to them. So yeah, you're right. Like it seems hypocritical from a historical perspective, but what really happened was just spite. I mean, they didn't really care about slaves. The average citizen of the Union didn't like slavery. Not that
Or
big of a
black
fan of
people.
black people.
Right, exactly.
Lincoln wanted them to be sent back to Africa, right? Didn't he?
Lots of them. Lincoln was all.
That's how Liberia got started.
Jinx.
That's right. Yes. Liberia is a very interesting historical example because those slaves that were sent there and set up this free society basically became like an aristocracy, lording it over the native blacks.
Yeah.
For
Right,
like
but look what they did to Haiti, right? Like clearly they don't like. Clearly the federal government of the U.S. does not like freed slaves, right? I mean, they intentionally allowed. I mean, they basically gave the French like the go-ahead to invade and take all the gold out of the banks and do whatever the hell they wanted afterwards, and then
I mean, they kind of killed all the white people. So, and this was a big thing. Like, for example, Jefferson was way more for freed blacks in America before Haiti than after.
Sure.
Right.
That became like
You don't want
specter.
everyone you know to get murdered. I mean, it's
exactly.
no reason.
The Haitian revolutionaries had no concept of optics. You know?
To be fair,
Just, I mean, I think any revolution where they speak French, apparently, they just don't know
It's
where
real bad.
Yeah.
to be fair, they didn't kill the Poles because they knew Poles were they were liberal and they opposed slavery.
Poles are the
So those are the
People
Poles.
from Poland?
So
They're in Haiti?
well, okay, so this
Not
is,
anymore.
This is yes, they are. I mean, maybe they might. Let's see. During the French Revolution, right, when Haiti was still, well, first they freed the slaves and they were like, well, why don't you go back and we'll sit and think about this. This was a big problem. Well, no, they went back to slavery.
Oh, they went back to slavery.
Yeah, and that the slaves didn't really like that for some reason. But okay, this was in the context of the revolution, so Napoleon was a big defender of the Polish state, which didn't exist and then created it again. So there was Polish troops in the garrison in France and in Haiti to defend against, for example, like the British Empire coming in and conquering Haiti and getting all that lucrative, sugar cane. So when the revolution happened, the Haitians knew that the Poles, for example, were not to blame for defending slavery. And in fact, a lot of them straight up just defected to their side. But even Polish civilians were spared. If you spoke Polish, you weren't killed in basically the genocide. So that became, and they
Poles confirmed not white.
Poles confirmed not white, exactly. And yeah, they intermarried and they became kind of part of the colored aristocracy of. It's always funny. Whenever this oppressor class gets knocked out, another one just rises up.
Right.
And yeah,
That's
the mulattoes.
That's Burnham, right?
Well, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, that's elite theory.
Yeah.
Basically, is that there has to be an elite.
Hierarchy, yeah. That's how he works.
Yeah.
Let's move
But
on.
where were we? We were talking about Haiti. We were talking about Poland.
We were talking about how the Poles got spared and then integrated into society.
No, but you were talking about
And
Jefferson
Liberia.
before and after in the French Revolution.
Right. Yeah, and the Civil War. So yes, the idea that Civil War was about slavery. It was not. The secession was about slavery, and this is what
Yeah, that's an important point, and I think that neo-Confederates, which a lot of us libertarians would not label ourselves as, but people who sort of have sympathies for secession in general, even when it hurts, slavery was involved, and that's sort of maybe that's the one flaw. That's a lethal flaw in the Confederacy in the United States.
Well, yeah,
which is that they were anti, they were not a libertarian force, and they, in their constitution, they said this is a slave society based on the supremacy of the
But so
white.
is the United States.
Well, I mean, fair enough.
My
yeah.
only point is that the seceding group might, I mean, yeah, there's going to, whatever the societal arrangement is, it's going to be bad. Whatever the bad stuff is, they're going to have.
Well, okay, so there is a little nuance here. The Deep South states, their secession conventions very explicitly says we are seceding for the radical abolitionist North. We do not want to abolish this institution which upholds all of society. Right? So that's all those, like South Carolina, Florida, represent, Mississippi, Alabama, right. The Upper South did not secede for slavery, and that's the big populous ones. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and the border states that tried to secede, Missouri, Maryland, Kentucky didn't secede, but it stayed neutral. Their cause was not to defend slavery, but the idea that Lincoln called up troops to crush the rebellion. They were seceding out of the principles of the Constitution and
from tyranny,
and nullification and decentralization. So it's a very complicated. It's one of the most complicated stories in American history. Like, you can't just say they
That's not what I learned.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you have, I mean, there's all kinds of different, like, the Native Americans who allied with the Confederacy because they hated, the Feds were the ones taking their land.
So it sounds like, to bring it to the topic of the panel, like, it sounds like it was a pan-secessionist strategy that paid off because they basically united a bunch of coalitions that had their own
did it pay
grievances.
off?
Almost.
Well, we're so close.
Well, paid off in the sense that they got as far as, like, uniting and actually kind of
that's true.
Making the effort.
And then, of course, it would be much easier for one of those individual states to secede from the Confederacy after, you know? So that allows for greater secession in general.
Yeah, like you could have had those northern border states if they had been allowed to secede, and they're like, we're not really all about this whole slavery-based constitution thing. We'll do our own thing. We'll be like a border state.
Right. I mean, and the reason why all those border states and the Upper South, they were not that into secession at first is because they didn't have that many slaves. I mean, 50% of South Carolina was enslaved. Like 10% of Arkansas was enslaved. Like, very different economic structure and demographics.
Well, I think one of the best things that Hoppe said is, and I think that there are sort of people who sort of love Lincoln and will say the same thing, is that the Civil War was sort of the second American founding.
Yeah.
That
That's
the
what
United
Rothbard
States,
said.
the United States before the Civil War and the United States after the Civil War were different countries with different rules. And I mean, the 13th and 14th, the amendments that they passed after that obviously part of that, but also is the implicit idea that secession is not actually right.
And it's not even on the table.
That the right that the founders declared against the British Empire is no longer allowed for. And that was pretty significant.
And then Lincoln replaced the 4th of July with Juneteenth.
I'm sorry. I think you had something to say, and we interrupted you. Do you remember what you said?
Yeah, it's all good. We were talking about how one oppressor turns into another oppressor, right? And I was just going to make the comment that for the southern states that had formed the coalition, after the secession, it was business as usual. I mean, they were still making agricultural deals with Germany. They were still selling grains and other goods and products. And I mean, to them, it was not. There was. You guys already made all the points, but there was absolutely no this is like a liberty movement, right? This was clearly an economic movement. I feel like for the parties involved, and that's really all I was going to say, because they were certainly still buying gold from the Germans and the Spanish out of Mexico and South America, and minting that gold inside of the South, and using that gold for their commerce, and then trading their goods and this coinage outside of the country, and there were European nations that officially recognized the South as its own state. I know the Germans did for sure, and so That's really all I was going to say there. But I was surprised that you put Virginia in this list of border states that was
The
not
upper
really
South.
in it for the slavery, because Arlington, Virginia, historically is where the majority of all the slaves that got brought into America came from.
That is true.
And
Well,
so there certainly was a pro-slave class in Virginia and in the aristocracy of Virginia.
the old planter class, I mean, list of America.
Right.
Let's be clear, were Virginians.
Right.
But during the first half of the 19th century,
Anthony Johnson.
a big shift in the economics of slavery happened. From the big tobacco plantations in Chesapeake Bay. I mean, this is why, like, Delaware was a slave state, but it had, like, by 1861 had 50 slaves.
Right.
But Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia were these huge slave states because they were producing tobacco, which grew really well in the Chesapeake Bay basin. But of course, that all shifted with, your history class, I'm sure, taught the invention of the cotton gin, being more efficiently being able to produce cotton.
And tomatoes.
And tomatoes. Yeah.
Also, cotton was harder to steal than a lot of other cash crops because it had to be ginned, and it was put into these big bushels where a lot of other cash crops were easy to conceal and smuggle out.
Right, you had to get so much of it for it to be worthwhile of a price for the size of business we're talking
Right,
about.
but that shift in the economics made the Chesapeake Bay, it was no longer the focus. It was all that dark soil in the Mississippi. That's when Deep South overtook the Upper South in terms of not only economic production, but also concentration of slaves. So yes, historically, of course, Virginia, big slave state. By 1961, not so much. Not maybe as much as you might expect.
That is where they put their capital. Which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it was Richmond.
Richmond was the capital.
Well, there were many capitals of the Confederacy, but something important is, while it wasn't the biggest slave state, it was the biggest state in the Confederacy, most populous.
And clearly already a well-blooded state in the war, because Virginia did fight pretty hard in the Revolution.
Well, sure, it was right. It had Washington, D.C. right there. That's like something like 25% of all the battles in the Civil War took place between Washington, D.C. and Richmond.
Yeah, a lot of it around Fairfax County. Definitely. It's kind of interesting though, that well-blooded culture that I was talking about still kind of exists in Virginia to this day. Like this anti-status, warrior caste kind of system.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you go into the Appalachian Hills and stuff like that, people that culture definitely still exists in that state, and I feel like it's kind of ingrained in certain regions of it. But that area is very, very anti-statist now, at least. Maybe not so much back then. So it's an interesting transition to see. Now they're kind of more about leave us in the hills.
Right.
The other thing I think to point out is that I think that the Civil War could have also been avoided if the United States had gone along with the plan of many other Western countries of compensated emancipation.
Slave buyback program.
Because that was done with the British Empire and France and I think Spain, Portugal probably did something similar.
Everyone did, basically.
Yeah, it was Haiti and the United States that had different. Heck, even Russia, when they ended serfdom around the same time as the Civil War, compensated the landlords, as they were called.
Well, yeah.
Well, rightly so.
For the serf class. So that I think could have easily avoided, but there was this radical need to keep the Union together. Lincoln even said that slavery wasn't that important to him in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, the Corwin Amendment, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, it was an amendment that would basically put the right to slavery in the Constitution. And this was proposed as a way to keep the South in the Union. And Lincoln wasn't the guy who came up with it. It happened.
Well, who was the guy who came up with it?
Corbin.
Oh, of course.
Who was a senator?
A Republican senator.
A Republican senator. And he wanted, and people really wanted South just to come back. They didn't want to fight over it. They were
More
like, listen,
brother wars.
it's just they thought it was another nullification crisis, right? South Carolina says they're going to secede. The Union puts down its place like, if you secede, you're going to get in trouble. But here's a little carrot with that stick. We're going to make sure we're not going to take your precious slaves.
And didn't Lincoln, when he proposed the bill that did make slavery legal, wasn't it only illegal in northern states at the time?
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to slaves in so not even like parts of the Confederacy that were controlled by the Confederacy. So Louisiana was conquered in 1862, one of the first slave states to fall, but they did not free the slaves in the Emancipation Proclamation. Nor were there was other parts of the.
Did Maryland keep their slaves?
They kept their slaves until the 13th Amendment was passed. So yeah, it was a very strategic way of basically. He didn't free any slaves in his lifetime.
He also supported laws, I think, from states to forbid the migration of free black people.
Yeah, he enforced the Fugitive Slave Act and as where he could. That's what the main point of U.S. Marshals during the Civil War is to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act.
Because we're a nation of law.
Yeah. Well,
If you don't like
three.
the law, just lobby to repeal it.
It's 3.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for coming. I hope you
Stopping by,
liked our
guys.
little discussion.
Yeah. Thanks for organizing.
Thank you.